All right, hello and welcome to the first inaugural and probably the last of this podcast we're ever going to do. Turn down my royalty-free music. It's me, KSG here. I'm here with former Little Cup tier leader, Corporal Levi, 17.5k manager.
That was a mistake.
Yeah, probably. And then
I'm one, man. I don't know what to do.
I think he set that up so you introduce yourself. You can be like, "Hey, I'm Levi, former LCTL."
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I am all of those things, and yeah.
Nobody's ever been quite as good as the game. That's why he's so highly valued. And then fresh off of his reqs post, we've got Shrug.
Yep, I am Shrug, the best poster in LC suspect history. I have not been posting.
Man, that was injustice.
I will be posting for Vullaby because we need to keep it. It is imperative that it stay in the tier.
The people want to know, did you get infracted?
The people want to know whether I got infracted. I did not get infracted, but I did get a very angry and hurt private message from an LC moderator asking why I put them in the position that senior staff was yelling at them because I was too good at posting.
Damn, I really have to wonder who that is, but it's a mystery and I don't think we'll ever know.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to find out.
Honestly, it was probably Levi. He's well known for moderating. So, the reason why we've got this meeting of the minds here is because we're in the middle of a very impactful suspect test. One that, if it, depending on how it goes, and there's a lot of speculation about where the votes are right now. A lot of calculating. I'm about to lose to Gummy here. If this Vullaby ban happens, which I don't think is likely at the moment, but if it does, we're going to have a major change. Probably the biggest change to this tier that we've had in a decade.
Second biggest after knockoff, well, I'd say.
So, after the power boost to knockoff, second biggest tier change ever. Now, that hasn't happened yet. There's no guarantee that it will happen. But there's a lot of debate happening right now over people perceiving the tier to be stagnant. A lot of people are complaining. Now, people always complain about playing current gen. I don't think that's new. But lots of people opting out of playing SSLC, looking for ways to shake up the tier. And I think you've seen that in some of the rationales presented. People don't even necessarily want to make arguments as to why Vullaby is broken, although those are certainly out there, and Levi, you could talk about that in a moment. A lot of people just want to shake it up. So, with me, I've got two people on very diametrically opposed sides of this debate. Levi, as you may have noticed if you were reading the metagame discussion threads, kind of led this thrust, dropped the big pro-ban Vullaby post. And then we've got Shrug on the other hand, who has been promising to post for several years now. Had to play 70 games on the ladder first. But we're back, we're here. A guy with very strongly known views on cheese and what he thinks should be in the tier, and an anti-banner. So, Levi, I'll let you have the floor. We've all seen a lot of your arguments and a lot of the arguments as to why Vullaby's broken, but what do you think? Why should we vote to ban this mon?
Well, I guess I don't have that much to add from the posts I've already made. I will say that I guess I'm pretty old-fashioned in my adherence to the smug on tier policy, and that I don't think shaking up the metagame should ever be a reason for or against a suspect or a ban. It shouldn't even matter for a suspect, but I don't think it should be a reason for or against the ban either. Like if Vullaby is keeping other brokens in check, then we get rid of those brokens too. Conversely, even if the metagame is stale, if Vullaby is not broken, then it's not broken. Like, we shouldn't just go around banning the best mon because it's the best mon. That being said, I think Vullaby is far and away the most broken Pokemon we've ever allowed to stay in LC for like more than a few months. It's ridiculous. Like it has more usage right now than Munchlax did in DPP. Okay, so usage is just an illustration. It's not a reason in and of itself. Like we've had other mons with like 80+% usage in the past. We've had SM Vullaby and Black and White Mischievous, XY Gligar, and I think that's pretty much the end of the list. But it kind of helps to illustrate how ridiculously centralizing Vullaby is. Like you can say other like the metagame does, like every top mon is going to influence the metagame, but the degree to which Vullaby does it, like, I mean, we opened this podcast by saying that like if Vullaby gets banned, the tier is going to be unrecognizable, right? Like if Mienfoo getting banned is not going to make the tier unrecognizable. Diglett getting banned is not going to make the tier unrecognizable. Pinch getting banned in SM didn't do anything to the tier. Like everything else stayed the same. So I'm sure Shrug has an opinion on that too. Vullaby being banned it wouldn't be the same tier anymore, right? I think that that's kind of like it helps to show like where Vullaby is at right now in terms of like how the metagame evolves around it. I don't want to go into detail on specific arguments, but that's kind of like a broad overview of how ridiculous Vullaby is to begin with.
And of course, the common thread among all those Pokemon that you mentioned, XY Gligar, Black and White Mischievous, those two got banned. Mischievous, of course, way after the fact, and that was a minor bit of controversy, although I'd say Black and White's having a bit of a resurgence now in terms of interest. But
yeah, I think the issues around it were by like how the ban was done, not by the ban itself. I don't think anyone still disagrees with the metagame being vastly improved by removing a mon that was quite literally mandatory on every team. That was like 6 mons of Chiefs. Hope that sounds familiar.
All right, so Shrug, counterpoint. Why is Vullaby healthy?
I will be the Gord Vidal in this firing line debate. So I guess the best way to demonstrate how polarizing, for people who don't know, how the Vullaby debate has been, is that while Levi says it's the most broken thing we've ever allowed in the metagame, the word, like when I've been drafting a post in my head to argue against a Vullaby ban, has been calamitous. Like it would be a calamitous decision for the tier and maybe the worst I've ever seen since I've joined the Little Cup community. In that, I don't think Vullaby is over-centralizing the way we traditionally think of it. What I think Vullaby has is a unique function in the metagame where it kind of allows the disparate offensive elements in the tier to kind of cohere together, and it allows them to kind of like exist in the same space rather than like moving past one another. And it does this by operating on both sides of the essential fighting type and fighting type check relationship. So Vullaby's obviously like a soft fighting check. We all know this. It can come in on like Mienfoo fake outs, kind of temper mach punches or whatever, and kind of pick up speed from that and still have the HP to attack or whatever. But it also kind of is a big threat for Fungus or for Marini, and kind of the utility of Spritzy, and kind of the reason people try to continue to make it work is the fact that Spritzy both checks fighting types and checks Vullaby in like a soft sense by itself. So without Vullaby in the metagame, you need a mon that functions in both ways. So you need both a secondary fighting check and you need a secondary way to attack kind of fighting type counters that essentially will split the metagame in half and basically make it even more matchup based than it is currently. So the centralization of Vullaby allows for a greater or a more recognizable or tolerable diversity in the other set of Pokemon that you can bring at a given time. That makes it work. I'm willing to clarify that argument if it didn't make sense.
Can I interject?
Sure.
Yeah, recognizable. That's completely true. The metagame will not be recognizable without Vullaby. I will say that. So your claim is that Vullaby basically glues the tier together. Does that summarize your argument?
Say it again.
It's basically like the glue that holds the tier together.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's obviously like kind of reducing your point, but the thing with that, okay, so first of all, I'm gonna go back to like following tiering policy. If Vullaby is the reason other like potential brokens are not broken, then I don't think that should, like, tiering policy wise, that shouldn't be a reason to keep Vullaby. But as a whole, I don't actually agree that Vullaby is necessary for a healthy metagame. So like no one's actually going to argue that the immediate post Vullaby metagame is going to be balanced or tolerable or whatever. There's no chance of it. It's basically going to be a new generation once we ban Vullaby. Like that's the degree to which it influences the tier. We're going to need further bans to let it settle down and so on. But I think it's pretty easy to find counter arguments to the idea that we need an offensive, soft fighting check for the tier to operate. Just like black and white. That would be that's probably like considered the best little cup tier right now. And we have nothing of the sort. We have a couple of hard checks. We have Ghastly or Oris, where Fletchling basically is going to lose to me and Fu 1v1 every time. Vullaby has tools around that, right? It has Protect, has whatever. But like I don't see how a single role can ever be necessary. It would be necessary in like for the tier to be glued together in the manner that it is glued together now, right? Like centralized around Vullaby. But I don't see why that would be better or worse than a metagame without Vullaby.
Okay, maybe I should clarify my point. I don't find the black and white or the ORS example particularly persuasive because of
whether it's broken, not on whether the post Vullaby metagame would be better. Even though, to be clear, I do think it would be better because you get your build with 6 months instead of 5. You don't have to dedicate a slot to.
All right. So basically, what I'm thinking is that the central problem that I identify with the metagame right now is that it's kind of like a short blanket in that you can't ever cover everything. So whenever you're building a team, and if you go all out to kind of stop both, say, Vullaby and Grookey, let's say, you're going to have created a team that's probably weak to Pony G. Or if you go out to create a team that like isn't going to lose to, say, like Vullaby and Abra, then you're going to be fight weak. Or if you go out to a team that's going to stop like every special attacker, then you're going to be Vullaby weak. So like that is the central problem of not only the current LC metagame, but like every LC metagame after Nock improved. I think it's difficult to compare any tier to black-white because like Nock is such a seismic difference, and kind of the attendant like availability of berry juice is also such a seismic difference that you kind of have to be working within the sphere of ORS, SM, and SS. But yeah, so it always works like that, where good LC metagames are ones where you're kind of like the better player wins by dictating the pace of the game. So you're getting the positive turns, you're using your Vullaby effectively, you're kind of like using your Mianfu effectively, you're kind of like dictating what happens rather than just like letting matchups do it for you and kind of just like switching in and walling everything. You need to be kind of like proactively offensive. Now,
Yeah.
if Vullaby,
Oh, sorry. Go on.
so Vullaby allows you to do that, in it kind of like provides a semi-check to everything that can also offensively threaten a lot of things. And without it, you're essentially going to be relying on like having to check everything by itself. And I don't think that's a tenable state for an LC metagame with knockoff in it. I don't think that's a tenable state for an LC metagame where kind of like evaluates are so easily removed that special attackers in particular can break through things. Like, there's no Lilleep in this metagame. Like, there's no viable Munchlax in an SS metagame. Although I don't think Munchlax is viable in black and white, so you can ignore that. But, like, I think, and I mean, this kind of like, I'm sort of circling around the question of brokenness because I sort of see it as immaterial in some sense, where Vullaby is kind of like so centralizing that it almost defies kind of a definition of brokenness, because like in no game am I like, oh, I immediately lose to Vullaby, but that's also a consequence of the fact that I've like over prepared for it in building. Like, I'm always going to have an Onyx, I'm always going to have like a double check if I don't use Onyx. What I will say is that like I don't find the argument that Nasty Plot Vullaby pushes it over the top especially persuasive. I've never really had a problem with that outside of kind of like the screens or the webs context, which we'll get to next. But I think in looking at Vullaby, you can't sort of make it a question of narrow brokenness or kind of like a tiering definition, because it's such a unique mon in what it does, like both its kind of like stat and capabilities or whatever, and it's kind of like resulting function in the tier, that you can't actually look at it in any other way than removing this kind of essential element is going to change the tier in such a massive way, and to look at it in a different way I think is sort of missing the point.
Oh, I want to jump in on that because it gets us to a point that I've thought a little bit about. Nasty Plot Vullaby, insofar as it gets brought up, now I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't read the thread. There's a lot of words in there, and I don't really feel like it. But a lot of the time when people...
Man, remove this from the podcast.
No. I'm being completely candid about my my level of information. But
I'm withdrawing my KSG council nom. You can take that as a retraction.
We all know where that's going. But Nasty Plot Vullaby, a lot of the time when people talk about Nasty Plot Vullaby, there's this sort of like, it's been written off, I feel like, in this conversation, where people tend to assume, especially pro banners, people will just assume that Nasty Plot Vullaby is broken. And a lot of the discourse around Vullaby in the suspect has been how warping it is to the tier. Like, how do you deal with physical Vullaby? How do we this and that? Why is 25-15 Timber so viable at this moment in time? But people don't really talk about Nasty Plot Vullaby, which has been sort of a bane that's been hanging around the entire generation. Now, Shrug, you just said you don't find that Nasty Plot Vullaby is broken, so I want to hear a little bit on how you think that's true. And Levi, I want to hear you speak on this, because a lot of what you've said is really about the physical set.
Yeah, I would like to respond to Shrug on that as well, but like, yeah, we can move on to the Nasty Plot Vullaby for the time being.
Yeah, okay. So I will say that the argument that I find most persuasive for a ban is in the indistinguishability between physical Vullaby or kind of like knockoff Brave Bird Heatwave sets and true Nasty Plot sets. But I do not find the Nasty Plot set to kind of be broken on its own. And I feel like people don't play correctly against Vullaby when they attack it, right? So like, you need to go at it right away. You can't let it have like a free turn to Nasty Plot and then like you're clicking Fake Out and now it's an 84% Violite Vullaby at +2/+2. You're gonna lose. But I think if you make it a priority when you read a team preview that it might be a Nasty Plot Vol, that you're setting rocks up. You're not putting yourself in a position where it's going to set up for free, just like you wouldn't let like Agility Pori or kind of like DD Scraggy or in older metagames like Shell Smash Shelder set up for absolute free against a Pokemon that can do nothing to it. If you're kind of always putting yourself in that position, then the Nasty Plot set isn't broken, at least like outside of the context of webs and screens, like I said before. But So like I said, I'm sympathetic, but not persuasive to the argument that it's hard to know which one is which. Like, you can't tell right away. But if you do a good enough job, particularly reading how they play it in the early game, and when they kind of like don't take opportunities to leverage their vol that maybe they should have in the early game, then you can know it's Nasty Plot Vullaby and plan accordingly. And then if you can do that, it's obviously a very good and a very strong sweeper in Pokemon or whatever. But it's not broken in the way that it says it is, and I get that flinches are annoying, but I don't think they determine enough games for that to be a determining factor in us getting rid of a Pokemon that I think is overall healthy for the metagame.
Flinches are annoying. We should mod those out. Levi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so I don't know what you say. I mostly have been talking about physical Vullaby because I don't know what you say about Nasty Plot Vullaby, honestly. I feel like it's pretty hard to gauge its position in the metagame when physical Vullaby exists. Like, it's already getting used more than like Vullaby or Scraggy or pretty much any competing sweeper, but like I don't know where it would be at, and how much of that is because, unlike Vullaby or Scraggy or so on, even Nasty Plot Vullaby actually does have some defensive utility, just not nearly as much as the defensive presence and utility. I guess those are kind of separate things, just not nearly as much as a physical Vullaby. I don't know whether it's like, I think like Woobat is a pretty clear-cut example of a sweeper that's broken right now. I don't know if you guys agree, but if we get to that later, I think like just running down the list of its checks and seeing how few of those are otherwise more than barely viable. Like, almost all of them are purely for Woobat, those checks. There's a good number of them, but that doesn't change the fact that it's forcing you to use dumb stuff that you wouldn't otherwise ever use. And I don't know how Nasty Plot Vullaby relates to that, because physical Vullaby is such a large part of Vullaby's presence. Like, would we really see that much Onyx? I feel like we wouldn't. And that's the big Nasty Plot Vullaby check right now. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, that can actually get us to our next topic, which is sort of a meld. When you look past Vullaby at the problems people have with the tier and the very, very common themes, Shrug is on the record commenting on this, even though he's been suppressed by the thought police.
That's not the word, man. He's had
some things to say on the matter. So the issue of screens, most of all. Webs, of course, we had a suspect on that a few months back. I feel like webs are not especially prominent right now. Probably a ton of Staryu usage has something to do with that, but also just the effectiveness of screens as an archetype, and as that ties into Woobat and also Scraggy. So I think a lot of people have problems with these mons. Scraggy maybe less so. I've seen less talk or chatter about that the past couple of months. But Woobat, as you mentioned, Levi, is something that a lot of people have discussed as broken. I personally think that Woobat should go. I haven't gotten a full opinion from Shrug on this. We can get that in a moment. But as you said, I think Woobat very clearly fits this sort of traditional mark of it's a sweeper and its checks are extremely limited. You can power through the dark types in the tier with a frail psychic type, which seems a little absurd. And then you end up with just wonky stuff. There's certainly Magnemite and to a lesser extent Onyx, although even Onyx has to win ties. And then you get stuff like people trying to check Woobat with Carvana and Scraggy to some extent. It's a very interesting mon. It's very inextricably bound to screens as an archetype and this sort of idea of cheese, which we've seen a whole lot of on the suspect ladder. But Shrug, I know this is your passion project, so if you want to comment on where we are with Woobat and screens.
Yep. All right. So I think basically, in order to understand my position on screens, I think we need to acknowledge some truths about the game we play competitively. Like, if you listen to this podcast, you're a freak who plays competitive Pokemon on the internet. you've walked down that life path, and in doing so, you sort of necessarily understand that Pokemon is not designed to be like an optimal competitive game. You go 30 seconds on the suspect ladder, you're going to encounter kind of like Book of Job level horrors and kind of like trials put to you by the RNG god in a way that will like make you question whether you should play Pokemon at a competitive level at all. So with that in mind, you kind of have to look like, why are we playing this game in particular? And the one unique thing that I think Pokemon has that other games do not is kind of like the building stage, the ability to put together a team, the ability to kind of like think creatively about what works, how you can kind of cover things, how you can kind of make up for deficiencies in your team, how you can kind of like attack a specific opponent or kind of like exploit tendencies or weaknesses they have. And this is kind of like the interesting and fascinating part of the game and the like real redeeming facet of Pokemon as a competitive game. So when you take something like screens, right, that is essentially reducing the game into a series of kind of luck related incidents. So like, what is the luck that we have at team preview, and whether the team brought some, or whether the opponent brought a team that is kind of like weak to the variant of screens or in a different era webs that I brought that day. And then during the game, like, am I going to win this 50-50 between like, I don't know, my 13 speed Staryu and my, or yeah, Icy Winded 13 speed Staryu and my Jupiter, or like between my 17 speed Woobat and my Head Smash Onyx. So it sort of saps out an essentially competitive part of the game and kind of makes it like an actuarial kind of like playing the percentages type setup in a way that is kind of like antithetical to not only what I like about Pokemon, but kind of like the only virtues Pokemon has as a competitive game. Like, screens and webs are the only teams we kind of tolerate seeing like 15 versions of in the same team tournament. Like LCPL or whatever, we're gonna see like like last SM, we saw like the same webs team like 10 times or whatever. So understanding kind of like why we play the game and kind of like what is good about it and what we like about it and what's interesting, like as a spectator, as a player, the games to think about and play are the games that don't involve screens in it or whatever. And I think that like screens right now and kind of webs in the past have been effective enough to make them like not only a minor annoyance, but like a real impediment to kind of like laddering or playing at a competitive or even team tour level. And that's why I support, like, I don't know the exact policy fix for like whether we ban light clay, whether we ban the moves, whether we ban not to, or like whether doing Woobat itself would kind of be sufficient, but some measure that kind of like brings the metagame back in line with what I think is good and what I think like a lot of people, if they like ask themselves seriously like what they liked watching about the game, would admit is kind of like a superior way of like thinking about the game and then kind of like building for it and then playing the actual games.
Yeah, so I guess I do have a response to this. For the idea that, I guess, I don't think the concern is with the matchup itself. Like the idea that team building is a major part of Mons, I agree with that. But to reach that optimal like Webs or Veil's team does still take some building skill. I thought I was pretty impressed by like Serene's in like end result of a Natu build. That being said, if these archetypes becomes like popular enough to have a significant presence in LCPL and so on, then it's up to the builder as well to be able to counter them. I think that's where Woobat is problematic, where other abusers are not. Just compare SM Veils to modern screens. SM Veils is not really suspect worthy, no matter what Taz says. But it's really just Wuban in particular. You can fit a Scraggy check into a typical standard build. You can fit a Grookey check into a standard build. These are things that if you are potentially facing a popular archetype, then you should prep for them. Wuban is not something that you like. Wuban, you have to run like Air Balloon Diglett. You have to run nonsense like that, or go for 50/50s. I should be honest. I will also say that Star is 12 speed after an icy wind, but yeah, that's something.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna make a note of it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. In that kind of like, to reach the end stage of a cheese team does require building skill, and like Serene's Grace has demonstrated amply that he is good at coming up with like the optimum versions of kind of like these matchup fish teams. But like once it reaches that end stage, there's kind of like nothing to it. You can kind of change the mons or whatever, but like the process by which kind of Screens teams or older Webs teams or older Veils teams got themselves set up and kind of working is kind of like replicable or whatever, and might be the only context in which Vullaby is broken. So like Nasty Plot Webs Vullaby or Nasty Plot Screens Vullaby, where you basically can't do damage to it, is maybe the one place where I'd be sympathetic to an argument that it's broken. But I really think that's something else. Like I think that it comes from the either invulnerability or kind of the speed that kind of Screens or Webs would bring it respectively, and that kind of any combination of sweepers in LC. Well, there will always be a combination of sweepers or attacking mons in Little Cup that can exploit kind of the power and the turns that those setups bring it, and that the only way of like ensuring that our metagame isn't constantly like tainted by this and we're playing like whack-a-mole to find like maybe it's Grookey's fault, like maybe it's Scraggy that's the problem or whatever. I think they're like Scraggy games where there are no webs or screens are very interesting, and kind of like working on like making sure chips happen and that kind of like Timber isn't in a position to kill it or whatever. That is like a fascinating game, but it isn't like that when it's just like screens are up, it's getting a free turn, it's over or whatever. So that is kind of like the approach I would take for it.
So yeah, I have a thought on this. I think part of what you're describing, Shrug, I don't think that these ideas are in conflict at all.
Optimal end state. I think in this case, in like a fair metagame, we've reached something similar to it. Like Webs teams don't really change that much anymore. Veils teams, not Veils, Screens teams tend to be pretty similar as well. I think in this case, it's the case because we have a broken abuser. But if we go back to like, let's say XY Webs, I think that would be an example of a cheese that didn't come off as unhealthy, because every single abuser had like a variety of reasonable checks that could be reasonably fit onto standard teams, and like as those standard trends developed, so did Webs alongside it. Like I'm sure you remember Brazilian Army Webs. That was like the de facto Webs for a good few months. But by the end of the metagame, I don't think Elekid really had a place on Webs anymore. Like Brazilian Army Webs was basically obsolete, and even now, like pretty much at no point in XY did Webs come off as broken. So you can argue that like Webs is inherently weaker or whatever, but I just don't think argument against cheese because of current iterations of cheese, which I do think are broken.
I think we lost you for a second there, but I think we got the gist.
So yeah, I don't think like, for example, Webs or I'm being cut off again.
No, we got you.
My connection really sucks, I think.
I hate Canadian internet. This has never worked for me, and I don't even live there. I'll comment on this. I think part of what's being described here is that, while it's definitely, there's an art to building proper cheese. We've seen a lot of creativity from Serene in particular this generation. Stuff like Sash, Phariseed, which is almost old hat at this point, even though that's only a couple months old. We've seen Sash Poniard, the Fling Drober. They didn't quite work out in LC World Cup finals. There's a lot of creativity that goes into building that, but the problem with games with screens and webs is that an optimally built screen or web team is relying on a very linear game plan. So basically, if it works very well, if it's well crafted for the metagame that you're using it in, it should win more often than not, because it should have outs, or it should have the specific setup that lets it reliably get into its sweepers in each game. So for example, the Sash innovations, Ferrocene and Poniard, even the Fling Drober, the point there is that you guarantee a paralyzation on Mienfu or whatever else, and then you can get into Natsu after setting your rocks pretty reliably. As reliably as you can, basically, with the caveat that Thunderwave is, of course, 90 accuracy these days. So if a team like that works, that means that every game is going to look very similar. Either you're going to have the proper counterplay that gets around the lead, say, for example, the right Bienfu set, Tauntfu, for example, or just whatever else, or you won't, and they'll get into Tyrant or they'll get into Woobat, and you'll have very little that you can do because the sweepers will just operate as intended behind a full layer of screens or behind webs or whatever. And you sacrifice these extremely valuable turns against very powerful sweepers, either spinning or defogging, just to get to these basic positions that allow you to compete. I think that for me is what frustrates me a lot about that archetype of team. I hope I've distilled, Shrug, what you're saying a bit.
Yeah.
Definitely, I wouldn't argue that XY webs are broken, but go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of rambled on to that effect, and you kind of did it very succinctly or whatever. And I think what I would ask Levi is that KSG and I are describing kind of the same state where all of these teams have kind of a flowchart plan to them. They kind of proceed linearly from setup to blank to blank to blank. And while you do have to make some decisions or whatever, it's nowhere near the amount of game planning that you have to do in kind of a balance versus balance or offense versus offense game, and that you can kind of reduce it to a formula or to a flowchart or whatever. And so to say that Woobat is the problem is to basically say there are no chains that will act in the same way without Woobat or whatever. That Woobat's way of so basically the team works in that you set up a mon, if it gets killed, you can set up on the next mon or whatever. So whether Woobat is so key to that in the mons it kind of sets up, and then the mons it forces in to stop it or whatever, I would listen to an argument saying that Woobat is the problem in that it's kind of so key to any chain for screens or webs or whatever that it's breaking them or whatever. Okay. But I don't think that's true, and that's kind of what we're getting at. And I mean I would be sympathetic to a Woobat ban just by itself or whatever, because I hate that shit, but I don't think it should detract from a greater argument about cheese as a concept or what we want from a meta, or whether we should keep screens with Woobat in or out. So you can respond to that if you want.
Okay, if you said anything in the last few seconds, I missed it. I got the rest of it though. So first of all, I'm getting the impression that these are two completely different trains of thought. You were arguing that cheese was not a reasonable part of the builder, and KSG is arguing that it's too flowcharty in the actual game. So I think those are not the same argument, but they're both valid. So I think I already tried to address the building thing. I think cheese is usually reasonable to build against if it doesn't have a broken abuser. On the flowcharty thing, yeah. So I actually do you said you don't think it's true that Woobat is the reason archetypes can be so flowcharty. I do think they are. Woobat in this case is the single abuser the single broken abuser that can lead these archetypes to be so flowcharted. Like either you win against Vullaby or you don't. Usually you don't. But in Vullaby's case, it is able to, in a single turn, set up to a position where it can want to KO pretty much every threat, and moreover, it has enough bulk to live pretty much every one to KO after it's set up. So it can set up easily, and it's a 6-0 straight up 6-0 threat once it's set up. I don't think other sweepers are able to do this. I think that they should naturally have counterplay given the tools we have in the metagame, and that would automatically avoid the flowcharty situation that's being described. Like if you have a Mianfu and a Fungus, and then a Vullaby and no other Scraggy checks, no other, like nothing else that can really beat Scraggy, even those alone will give you some counterplay against Scraggy. Not major counterplay, but some. And maybe like Final Gambit Dickler or something like that. I don't know how else you would build a team without any like solid Scraggy checks. It would have to be an archetype like that. But yeah, like if they can't want to KO you after a single turn, or if they lack setup opportunities, then you aren't going to be able to just decide the game off of being able to get screens and then switch your Vullaby in or whatever. Like if you set up screens and you get your Vullaby or your Scraggy or your whatever else in, chances are that they will still have hard checks.
I think Kate.
So you go ahead. I already forgot what I was gonna say.
Okay, I think the arguments that KSG and I were making are complementary in that, like, his argument about the flowchart or whatever is basically my argument about diversity of building, where you need to put in kind of the building stage enough sequential checks that will disrupt the flowchart at every stage where you're not getting swept. And that kind of like, that was related to my other point in that kind of like, it's not really a mind game in that sense, and it's also my point that kind of like you can give
this like I did not catch that at all.
For losing my man's, he's being tossed to the void.
Wait, can you hear me? Hello.
I can hear you. I think we're flying Levi-less.
Okay, so if Levi's out, I'm just going to keep
He'll come back. He'll come back when you least expect him.
But I think that he's also wrong in that like if you have Mianfu, Vullaby, Bungus or whatever, you can kind of fashion a Scraggy check if Scraggy doesn't have screens up or whatever. But like, what are you doing when Scraggy DDs on kind of like your pawn behind screens, and then you switch in Fu, and then Fu's doing like 60 damage, it's popping juice, it's getting another DD up. So like, LC is sort of by its nature reliant on soft checking and kind of maintaining offensive pressure and attacking and maintaining attacking impetus. That screens and webs prevent you from doing that and kind of force you into hard check mode. And it's just not a meta that it's just not a tier kind of by its nature that is set up to do that, or that you can ask its mons to do reliably. And that for that nature, I think cheese strats will kind of always be a problem that we're stuck with, and that we should take more aggressive action and kind of eliminating from the game.
Okay, I caught the second half of that. I didn't catch the first half at all, but I think I got the gist of what you're saying. So I guess what screens does is, if you have screens up, then you're right in that it's going to kind of like if like checks were on a sliding scale from super weak soft checks, like everything you name against Vullaby, to super hard checks, like I don't know, Spritzy for a strategy or something like that. then yeah, screens basically shifts you on that scale way towards hard checks. It does, the fact that you're using screens does automatically add another layer of counterplay to that, and that would be in denying screens, right? So whether that's actually a reasonable trade-off is I'm not actually sure of. And I think it is, like, I think Vullaby needs to go either way, but I think Scraggy is probably the mon that like will the easiest mon to help us decide whether the trade-off of having to give up a mon and introduce another layer of, while it's still introducing another layer of counterplay to make these individual setup sweepers that much more of a matchup fish by requiring harder checks, whether that's a fair trade-off. I think that is worth looking into. I'm just currently not sure of it outside of Vullaby, which I think is broken either way.
So I want to touch on one last thing with the last few minutes we have here, which is Grookey. So Grookey, very heavily tied to Woobat in the popular imagination, just because it enables all the grassy seed shenanigans that I think we would agree make Woobat a very threatening sweeper. But a lot of people are discussing Grookey as a problem in and of itself outside of these archetypes. Now, certainly it enables these archetypes by enabling Woobat, but Levi, you specifically have mentioned Grookey as a balance breaker, as I think at one point you refer to it as the elephant in the room in one of your posts. And certainly Grookey, a very influential Pokemon in the metagame. It's a lot like Fletchling in the sense that it just sort of chump checks a lot of stuff with the virtue its extremely strong priority. And it's keeping a lot of mons that people think, at least hypothetically, could be usable in the metagame, pretty much completely unviable. Stuff like Tortuga, Ammonite, you don't really see any of that. Even stuff like Mudbray is a lot less common in this sort of Grookey metagame that we have. So I want to hear from each of you relatively quickly what you think about Grookey and its presence in our metagame. So I guess I'll give the floor to Shrug here first.
Okay, so basically I think that Grookey is a very interesting mon. I don't think we've reached a kind of stage of theoretical metagame development where we can say that it's broken. I think people are too afraid to use the mons that are theoretically Grookey weak because the team structures that are required to accommodate Grookey are often weak to them. So like the team structures required to have an Elo Grookey are kind of like weak to Life Orb water types, are kind of weak to Mudbray kind of by their nature or whatever. And that because Grookey can't switch in and because there's kind of like eminently available hard checks to Grookey, kind of like Fungus or kind of like Coughing plus Vullaby or even something like Krogunk or whatever, that we should still be investigating whether those mons actually are viable but need to be used in a different way or in different combinations or kind of with a different package of ways of getting it in or getting them terms to attack without kind of like Grookey being able to switch in. And that if we go through that process and Grookey is still kind of warping the metagame or whatever, then I would investigate banning it. But I think it's very premature now to suggest, like, based on its sheer attacking power or whatever, that there's something to be done about it or that it should be banned.
Krogunk's kind of like the perpetual also ran. It's kind of like carry at the ball, where even in this metagame where we have so little Diglett usage, a lot of Trapinch, but not very much Diglett compared to normal, that thing still just feels bad, dude. I don't know if Krogunk is ever viable, but Levi, what do you have to say about Grookey?
Krogunk died once Vullaby became SSS tier. That's its own thing. Yeah, okay, so first of all, you keep on mentioning this elephant in the room thing, but like in the context of the post, it made perfect sense. Grookey is always the first mon up for discussion if we're going to discuss a post Vullaby metagame, because it's so directly influenced by Vullaby, right? Like everything Grookey does revolves around Vullaby right now. So yeah, I'm not saying it's the elephant in the room with regards to the metagame. Like that would probably be Serene Grace, right? He weighs like 600 pounds, but But
Jesus
yeah,
Christ.
as for like, I'm honestly okay with Shrug's stance of waiting to see how the metagame develops with respect to Brookie. It does, it is kind of destructive towards balance, man. I mean, like, you can look at its stats. This it's straight up Murkrow tier in terms of no, it's above Murkrow tier in terms of raw offensive capabilities. It's just a grass type, and we currently already are in a fantastic state against grass types because 100% of teams have Vullaby. But yeah, I'm okay with waiting on Gricky because, as Shrug said, like potentially a lot of the things that we see as being unviable because of Rookie may still actually have viability once we explore them more. At the same time, I hope Rookie doesn't go down the route of Vullaby. Like if Vullaby was introduced to the current metagame, and it ended like and it was like destroying the metagame to this degree, it would be a pretty obvious ban. But because we're so used to it, it just kind of feels harder to let go. And yeah, I guess I kind of want to like just go back to Shrug's point from a little bit ago, like when we were discussing Vullaby about how we should not be looking at it with respect to brokenness. I know, like afterwards, you also said that it wasn't broken, but from your from what you said, like just from how you described Vullaby, then I think it's pretty clear cut that Vullaby that you would agree that Vullaby is broken by most metrics, even if it's different from like early bad mods, right? Like you would agree that's broken, but you don't think the discussion.
I don't have a working definition of broken. Oh,
Well, are we good? What's happening? Hello?
I think he's still talking, but he cut out. So I tried to go, and then he came back in.
Oh no, he's dead. Well,
I did stop talking, and then I heard you start talking, and then I heard you cut off. Yeah.
All right. So
That's what you said.
yeah, so I don't have a working definition of broken that I could sort of use or apply, and I mean, I don't know what I would even say to kind of describe Vullaby as broken or not. It just doesn't feel broken to me, and I've kind of been reasoning based on like the effects it'll have on the metagame if it goes, and kind of on that basis, I think we need to keep it.
Okay. I can't actually recall off the top of my head the exact arguments you gave for like the post Vullaby metagame being worse at this point. For the brokenness of definition, I'm just the definition of brokenness. I'm just using the one on the tiering policy. It's a policy review. I think Albinson included it in his metagame discussion post. Yeah, it's just basically like a description of Vullaby. That's all there is to it. But yeah, so on. I guess I remember the gist of your argument against like the existence of a post Vullaby metagame, just being that I guess it kind of needs to exist. Like as we kind of need this kind of pivot / soft safety net to exist in an offensive metagame, right? I'm going to argue that the offensive metagame as it stands is mostly because of Vullaby. I think it's a ridiculously effective wall breaker. Like it has like it's just so good at what it does. It can pivot. It can it has a stab knockoff. It has strong stab moves, and it can also boost its speed. So you can't just trap it with Diglett or whatever. Or I mean how did we deal with us offensive mons in XY or something like that before we had Vullaby? Like we never really had anything on Vullaby's scale. Just like a regular Porygon or Sturdy Juice Mon or Abra or Fletchling was fine. But Vullaby kind of pushes the entire metagame towards offense because I mean, how do you create? I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that in the gens before Vullaby was broken. First of all, it's for sure broken in SM as well. Like the reason we didn't ban it was because it was too broken at too stage late in the metagame. Like it wasn't reasonable to develop the metagame after Vullaby ban at that point. So before Vullaby became broken, semi-stall could see viability, but having a mon that can fit on 100% of teams that can break cores in general to the degree that Vullaby can is naturally going to push the metagame towards offense. Not to mention how well it supports other offensive mons as well, between knockoff and pivot support. Mianfu can do that too. So that I don't think that alone is that much of a factor.
Sorry.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Finish that thought.
I think outside of Crookie, which is kind of on the verge of being suspect-worthy / broken, suspect-worthy should never be the debate level. I'm still kind of annoyed that it was made so for Vullaby. The debate should always be on whether it's ban-worthy or not. The community should decide through a suspect whether it's ban-worthy. But yeah, so Crookie is already on the verge of ban-worthy in the eyes of some members of the community. So Vullaby being banned has a very good chance of pushing it completely over the top. But beyond that, I don't see how the next best offensive mons like Mianfu or Timber or whatever are going to become ridiculous off of a Vullaby ban alone, because Vullaby is so dominant that if you are actually hard checked by Vullaby, you are not going to be viable to begin. Everything that Vullaby checks in this metagame is something that only soft checks at best. And yeah, I don't see how a soft check mon is, no matter how universal, is going to break the tier on its own. And also, the reason why it's effective as a soft check, and for example, we don't treat Porygon or Mianfu, those are also great mons, but the reason why we don't value it in the same way that we value Vullaby is because of Vullaby's combination of offensive strengths. It is ultimately going to be more threatening in the average game than a Mianfu or a defensive Porygon is. I guess agility Porygon may actually be equally or more threatening, but it's not going to really soft check anything in the same way.
Okay, so I could basically sum up my thoughts quickly because Ghost is trying to wrap it up. But basically, my argument is that no individual mon will become broken in Vullaby's absence, but the metagame's trend where you can't cover everything and you're always picking something to be weak to will in fact become worse because Vullaby provides so many checks while providing so much pressure or whatever, and that the way that Vullaby is balanced in the metagame is because you always need to decide between using it as a check in certain circumstances and then using it to become offensive or whatever. And that decision in a single game or whatever is highly indicative of a player's skill or whatever, and their ability to kind of read the matchup and what they need it for, and whether they need it to break things open or they need to kind of preserve its health at its berries used to check things or whatever, makes the rocks interaction more interesting. And without Vullaby, we're kind of going to be in a state where it's kind of well, I need to check fight types with this mon, and I need to check kind of offensive water types with this mon, and I need to check Abra and Ponyji with this mon or whatever. And that will kind of put too many burdens on team building where we're not going to suddenly have kind of a balanced semi-stall or balanced metagame. We're going to have competing offenses that try to get type advantages on one another in a way that's kind of horrifically unbalanced and will make us long for the days of kind of Vullaby as the universal check that allowed you to kind of use a more cohesive or comprehensive team.
Okay, yeah, so I do know that Ghost is trying to wrap this up, so I'll try to reduce this to a point of contention instead of making any new arguments. So first of all, I agree that the Vullaby metagame isn't necessarily unskilled. I don't think it has any effect on whether the metagame is skilled or not. My argument is purely from a team building sense. And while it is a soft check to everything, I think that would be more than made up for the fact that first of all, you're up one slot because you no longer have a mandatory Vullaby, and you're up another slot because you no longer need a mandatory Vullaby check. So I think that more than balances out your argument that you need different checks for other stuff as well. I think I'm fine with like just using that as my disagreement with your point.
Well, that's certainly a lot for our gigantic voter pool to think about. I forget the exact numbers on this, but if we get somewhere in the realm of about a dozen more voters, I think it's going to be the biggest suspect test in LC history. Certainly fitting for the size of the topic, and in about 48 hours, I would think, from me posting this, which should be on Saturday night, we'll know. What was that?
Yes.
Oh, this is just gonna go up on YouTube.
Okay. Is this like not like an LC Elite like meme video?
Meme video. I think I still have access to that account. I was gonna put it on my personal one.
That's the account with Warrior Cats and stuff, right?
Yeah, I don't really want to be associated with the Warrior Cats brand. I'm pivoting to being cool now, whether or not anybody buys it. But yeah, 48 hours for me uploading this onto the YouTube. We should know whether we're gonna have to completely remake this tier or not. And yeah, we'll see. A lot of you listening, if you're the kind of freaks who listen to a podcast about LC, you're probably voting. So be sure to vote right or else. But yeah, that's going to be it from us. Have a blessed day, brothers, and catch you on the flip side.